My name is Esther Leonard. I am the niece and godchild of Esther McCann. The night that we learned that Esther and Jessica had perished in the fire, I remember waking up early in the morning and hearing my granny like screaming, crying, and I didn't know what had happened. She told me, I was 8 at the time, so it's not something I could process easily. And I remember everybody inconsolably just bawling, crying, like it was like something out of a film. It wasn't like real life.
I was awoke by my grandmother. So I ran down the stairs and into the living room to find my mum in tears, told by my dad that Esther had died in a fire with Jessica. It was horrifying.
I'm looking at a number of photographs here. That's the one that hit me first as I arrived. And you can see the devastation. It certainly brings a lot back, quite vivid. It's almost as if it was yesterday.
Esther, aged 30, and 18-month-old Jessica died when fire swept through their home at Butterfield Avenue, Rathfarnham. Mrs. McCann's body was found lying outside her bedroom. Firemen found Jessica still in her cot. They both died from inhaling carbon monoxide fumes.
Esther McCann was 30 years old, married to husband Frank, and loved by her entire family.
Esther was a wonderful godmother. She was always very attentive to me. She made me feel really special. She just brought a light into the family that was so unusual. We would have seen Esther and Jessica on a daily basis. If we were not in Butterfield in her house, she was with us. Esther was the youngest of 4 in her family. They're from Tramore in County Waterford. She was an artist, a wonderful aunt, and just exuded life and happiness and joy, and she was just a wonderful person to be around and a wonderful person to know.
My name is Thomas O'Brien. I'm Esther's eldest nephew. Esther was a real happy-go-lucky, jovial, loving, caring person. Nothing ever fazed her, nothing bothered her. Always had a good bounce in her step. She was always good crack to be around. And she'd help anyone.
In September 1992, Pat Tracy was serving as a police detective in An Garda Síochána.
I was a detective Garda in Tala. I came in to hear that 2 people had lost their lives in a fire in Rathfarnham. A devastating fire.
My name is Michael Campbell. I'm a retired detective inspector. I was attached to the mapping section in the Garda Technical Bureau. Anything involving a deceased child, that's not taken away from the death of the lady involved as well, but the fact that a child was killed in this instance, it did touch the heartstrings. This photograph I took is where the child was sleeping that night before the horrendous event took place. And we can see cuddly toys, some child's playthings, and feeding bottles.
Pat and Michael were assigned to investigate the cause of the fire that killed Esther and Jessica.
The house was extensively damaged. We had to pick our way going in and going out of the house. We'd enter from the rear. I had worked on the Stardust where 48 people lost their lives. Devastating fire. This was another one. There was an intense fire, more intense than the normal.
In Initial investigations revealed an apparently obvious explanation for the fire.
There was a number of gas leaks reported to the gas board. I read statements that an engineer had made.
The gas company had been called before. There were some problems with the gas and leaking gas. There were certainly, I think, 2 at least before the fire.
My name is Frank McNally. In 1992, when all this was happening, I was a freelance journalist. During the month of July 1992, there were 4 separate leaks reported at the McCann house. First one was, I think, on the 3rd. It was investigated. There was no actual leak found on that occasion. Second one was the 16th. There was a major leak found then and a major presence of gas that was investigated and dealt with. The third one was the 26th, and in that case, the fitters found nothing.
Days later, there was a 4th, even more serious gas leak. Frank McCann was out at work when Esther's quick thinking averted a likely catastrophe.
Esther woke up when the house was full of gas. She got Jessica, brought her down, and had she flicked the switch, the whole house could have been blown apart.
Esther pushed her car out of the driveway because she knew if she had turned on that ignition, it could have set off a fire and killed the both of them. So she pushed her own car with Jessica into the street and then drove straight to our house.
Find out.
We had to keep an open mind as to what it could have been accidental. You know, we had to investigate thoroughly.
Martin Walker, Superintendent, Kildare South. In September 1992, I was a guard and I was stationed in the small village of Blessington in County Wicklow, and I'd been there for a number of years.
Frank McCann owned and ran his own pub, the Cooperage, in Blessington.
I remember the 13th of August in 1992. It was about 7:30 p.m. I was station orderly, and Frank McCann arrived at the station window and he knocked. And he made a report that he'd received 3 anonymous telephone calls of a threatening nature, 2 at the pub in Blessington. And 3 callers essentially suggested to him that he better have the pub well insured, and stopped the conversation thereafter. On the 25th of August then, he called once again into the Garda station, and he indicated that he'd received another threatening phone call in which the caller suggested to him that he knew he'd called up to the lads up the road, i.e. the Gardaí, and that he and that fucker across the road better be careful from now on.
The threats against Frank McCann continued right up to the day before the fatal fire.
I remember the 3rd of September 1992, Frank McCann pointed out 2 telephone numbers that had been identified and circled in red in the local telephone directory. One related to the Cooperage, and it had the words "burn" written in red after it. That same day, we found the words "burn you bastard" written in paint on the rear of the public house.
Frank McCann had been receiving threats at the pub and at his house and to his phone. His wife and child were burnt in a fire and somebody had done this to him. So we had to investigate and there was a certain urgency to it.
Frank McCann was not alone. In the same phone book was a threat against another Blessington publican.
On another page then you had the West Wicklow house. It had been circled in red and bastard written after that. In order to progress our local investigations, we interviewed the publican and he confirmed that he had received 2 threatening phone calls also. It was very unusual. We'd had nothing like that ever before in Blessington in relation to any of the public houses.
We invited Frank in 3 days after the fire and we documented all the threats that he had received. He was there quite a number of hours. He was a grieving husband and we had to let him compose himself and continue on then with the statement. You know, he would have broken down a few times now.
The threats against Frank McCann cast new light on the investigation, and Police Detective Michael Campbell of the Garda Technical Bureau was now brought in.
I would have been at a number of house fires, but generally speaking, the section wasn't really required to go to a fire unless there was something turning out to be suspicious. It was cordoned off. I had a cursory look inside the cordon, into the front garden of the house. There was a fair amount of fire debris which had been thrown out from the house by the fire service, making sure that the place was as clear as possible and as safe as possible for the technical team to see what was possibly the cause of the fire. There was significant damage throughout the house. As you go through the house, it was mainly the scorching and the smoke damage. Coverings are peeling off the wall. It's inferno type. Now, the stairwell, the level of damage there was horrendous. You can see the intense burning on the walls and on the newel posts and balustrade. I was led to believe that this was more than likely the seat of the fire. The gable wall, that wall had been scorched almost white. There was very severe burning in that area. That was something of interest, well, certainly was of interest to the ballistics person.
It was their belief that a payload had been added to the fire. A payload, by that I mean an accelerant. The fire was so intense and the heat was so intense that it wasn't the result of a normal fire.
The forensic team searched for evidence of a possible accelerant and found a clue amid the burnt wreckage.
It was very early to say, but there was some suggestion of small gas cylinders that were found in the debris outside of the house, that they may have played a part in it.
We would have liaised with forensic people and they would have been of the belief that it was arson rather than an accidental fire.
Meanwhile, even after the fire, the threats against Frank McCann continued.
Whoever is waging this appalling vendetta against the McCanns is not content with, the murder of his wife and child, because Frank is staying at the house of a friend and he gets a mass card from somebody signed the Reverend Byrne, a bad, not to mention sinister joke in the circumstances, and Frank is seemingly so upset by this that he collapses.
But some of Frank McCann's behaviour was harder to explain.
On the day of the funeral, we were going to Tramore for the Mass. We stopped halfway in Leyland Bridge for a bite to eat. We went in and had a sandwich and a drink. Where outside you could see Frank walking around the hearse, talking to the car, talking away to himself. You know, which I felt then was strange, and still today I feel was strange.
There was more bizarre behaviour later that day as the funeral cortege passed a group of school children.
We were coming from the church, heading up to a relation of ours' house. McCann was shouting out the passenger window of the car that he was free and he was available to these young schoolgirls. You know. This was when he just buried his wife and his daughter. So he had a sick, twisted sense of humour, that man.
A third incident the same day left the family asking questions about his state of mind.
That evening, rather than staying around for more with the rest of the family, he made his way back to the pub that he owned because he was throwing his mother a 60th birthday and had arranged to have a birthday cake, which was a very, very strange thing to do.
His mother didn't want the party, but Frank insisted it had gone ahead. It was organised, and he didn't see a reason why he shouldn't be at his mother's party after just burying his wife and daughter.
Days later, Frank invited Esther's sister to visit the burnt-out home where Esther and Jessica had died.
He rang my mum and said that the house had been released back to him from the guards. And we went in and walked around the house, badly burned around the hall, up the stairs, up onto the landing, into Esther's bedroom, into Jessica's bedroom. The shape of Jessica was still on the blanket in our cot. Her dowry was there, her bottle. The rest of the bed was all black, bar where she had lay. You could see her shape. Down the stairs and into the living room. And that was when he said to my mum, he was thinking of putting an ad in the paper for some charcoal for sale, which nobody found amusing, bar himself.
Within a week or two after that, he went on holidays to America. So I imagine for the Gardaí, it must have all seemed like very odd behaviour and not typical of a man grieving after his wife and daughter had been killed in a house fire.
Frank McCann was well known to police in Blessington, but not because he had a criminal record.
Frank McCann was the owner and operated the Cooperage pub, which is on the main street in Blessington. Myself and some of our colleagues, we used to go in there for our lunch and have an occasional pint as well. And we got to know Frank. Wouldn't have socialised with him, but did get to know him fairly well. Frank was an outsider. He came down and he ran a successful business in the pub. Well liked, I would suggest, and well accepted into the local society.
Frank and Esther married in 1987. They set up home in Rathfarnham in suburban South Dublin.
Frank was consistent. Frank was solid. He was a businessman. He seemed like he had his world put together and he had respect in the community. You know, he was involved in Ternier swimming. He was a bit bland. He's not someone that you would ever have thought that Esther would have gone for, but he was solid, and I guess that's what she needed at the time when she wanted to start a family.
By 1992, Frank and Esther were close to having the family they wanted because they had applied to adopt baby Jessica. Now Esther was anxious to get the paperwork completed.
Esther was determined to make the adoption final and legal. She wanted everything about Jessica to be legitimate and that there was no question that she was Jessica's mother.
She just idolised the child, and the child just took over her whole life, and not in a bad way or in a hard way. She was well able for her, and everything was around Jessica. Esther would have been very strong on her family values, and she would have wanted her to be Jessica McCann, or to have her own identity.
But Esther was frustrated by unexplained delays in the adoption process.
I think Jessica was just only a few months old when they put the process into the works. And from the very beginning, they were met with resistance. But Esther never really had an idea of what the problem was or why the adoption was running into trouble.
When things weren't going right with the adoption board, she couldn't understand why every box seemed to have been checked.
I knew there was an issue or a problem, that the adoption hadn't come through, but I didn't understand as to why. I thought maybe because Frank worked unsociable hours in a pub and that he wasn't home and wasn't able to do things that he should be able to do.
The delays continued, yet Esther was offered no explanation why.
I imagine Esther was completely consumed by the fact that that adoption case was being held up and not having the full details of why it was, not going through. And meanwhile, bringing Jessica up as their own and being completely crazy about her. That must have been a very, very difficult thing to live with.
Detectives now looked closely at Frank McCann, a champion swimmer, who held a senior role in the Irish Amateur Swimming Association, and he had his eye on the top job.
He was due to be made president of the Swimming Association, and there was Olympics coming up, and this was all in the pipeline.
McCann obviously was a person of some public profile. He was a big name in swimming, first as a swimming competitor, champion swimmer, and then as a swimming administrator, vice president of the Irish Amateur Swimming Association, so he would have been well known.
McCann had a reputation for turning young swimmers into champions, but shared the credit with two colleagues.
There were a lot of high hopes for the upcoming Olympics for our young Irish swimmers, a lot of whom, had been involved with the association since they were quite young. And between them, George Gibney, Derry O'Rourke and Frank McCann had trained a lot of champions. And he would have been, right there in the centre of it all.
At the time of the fire, George Gibney and Derry O'Rourke were at the centre of a paedophile sex scandal involving their swimming students. But it had taken 10 years to come to light.
It's believed that there were complaints being made to the association. And as it so happened that it was Frank McCann who was dealing with them, and he was either ignoring them or explaining them away, so they never went anywhere.
Both Gibney and O'Rourke were close associates of Frank McCann.
They were regular visitors to their home in Rathfarnham, so he would have been very connected to them, and when they would come into the house, they would sit in the kitchen, the three of them around the table, drinking tea. And if Esther had any cause or reason to go into the kitchen, they'd just fall silent, they'd just stop talking.
Derry O'Rourke was later convicted on 29 charges of sexual abuse against minors and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The Supreme Court later quashed 27 similar charges against George Gibney.
He was charged last year, but an order from the High Court prevented him from standing trial on the basis that the alleged offences had taken place too long ago to ensure a fair trial for Mr. Gibney.
Detectives now discovered Frank McCann was also attempting to contain a scandal. It involved one of his swimming students.
We had somebody of a high rank liaising with the adoption board, and they were limited in what they could divulge. There had been an objection to the adoption of baby Jessica by the mother of an individual whom it was contended was a student of Frank's.
It became apparent that Mr. McCann had had a child with a 17-year-old girl, and a complaint to that effect had been lodged with the adoption board.
The young girl that he got pregnant, who was 17 when she gave birth, was someone that he had been training. The baby had been born in and around the same time as Frank McCann and Esther were married. So that baby would have been about 5 years old.
The adoption board now has this complaint. They put it to Frank McCann. He denies the complaint. Esther doesn't know at this stage that this is the cause of the problem. She only knows that there is a problem, and it proceeds from there.
The formal adoption of Jessica had stagnated to some degree, and Esther was concerned about this aspect of it and was going to address the issue directly with Frank on the night, I think, of the murder.
Police now re-examined events on the night Esther and Jessica died.
Esther comes home about 10 o'clock. Frank comes home for about an hour between 10 and 11. So at 11, Frank heads back to the pub.
Sometime after 1 a.m, with Esther and Jessica asleep upstairs, a fire broke out in the kitchen.
There was a crash of glass and a sudden flash of flame from the house. Some people coming home from a wedding saw the fire burst out, very intense fire, and raised the alarm.
Fire crews raced to the scene. About 1:30 a.m, Frank McCann arrived. He seemed determined to save his wife and child from the flames.
Witnesses spoke about how Frank McCann reacted, how distraught he was, about how he almost tried to climb the ladder and had to be held back by firemen from trying to get into the house. You know, there was a lot of screaming and upset.
Detectives already suspected the fire was caused by arson. Now further investigation revealed the gas leaks were also caused deliberately.
It became apparent that the gas pipes that were in the little utility room of the kitchen had been tampered with.
When they investigated, they found damage to gas pipes that could only have been caused by the application of intense heat at some point, in other words, by something like a blowtorch.
An engineer had sealed an opening, a gas leak, and so it couldn't open again. He put an extra seal on. During one of the subsequent gas leaks, it transpired that this was parted. It suggested that a blowtorch had been used purposely and trained on this seal and had broken the seal and had been prized apart. Frank McCann was a cooper by trade. He worked in Guinness's. He would have been working with barrels, using blow torches, sealing barrels, replacing damaged pieces of barrels and what have you. He would have served his time and became a qualified cooper, so much so that he opened a pub in Blessington and he called it the Cooperage.
A series of gas leaks. Frank McCann's expertise with a blowtorch, and his secret child with a teenage student. The investigation now had a clear focus.
If what we were uncovering appeared to be true, it was a dreadful scenario. Somebody has it in for Esther, you know, and it was pointing to one person.
But the threats against Frank McCann's life remained unexplained.
We canvassed Mr. McCann. Had he any idea, any rationale or reason as to why this crime had been committed and he'd been threatened in this way? Did he owe anyone money, or had he had a row or anything like that? Usual run-of-the-mill type of inquiries that would be the commencement of something like this.
He was contending that there was some organisation that he was under threat, and, you know, we had to tread warily as well, you know, but inquiries revealed that this was not so.
There was an effort made to trace the telephone calls to his house and to the two pubs in particular. We were satisfied that, yes, it would appear that telephone calls were received, but we could never establish the genesis of them, who made them or why.
Various people would have been approached in Blessington and in Rathfarnham and around the city. You know, we would have had people with contacts in various organisations or illegal organisations, and these would have been approached, and everything was coming back negative. You know, that there was no substance to these allegations of threats.
Police concluded that, far from being the victim of threats, Frank McCann was the source of them.
They'd done the groundwork in Blessington then to cast doubt on any suggestion that he was the actual murderer. He was preparing a defence for himself.
As time was passing and more information was coming in by way of statements and little bits of information, it was decided we have a suspect.
With Frank McCann under suspicion, a series of earlier events were now cast in a sinister new light.
I think the most striking thing is the number of times he tried to kill them was just, you know, extraordinary.
There was a documentation about the electric blanket which had been left on the seat on the back of a chair, and it was found on the bed and it was on fire.
Esther wakes up to find a folded electric blanket at the foot of her bed on fire, and she hadn't plugged it in. She couldn't explain this.
You know, something that sounded almost laughable was that her brake fluid cable had been cut. And then, yes, I suppose the biggest one was that gas pipes had been tampered with in the house.
It all added up afterwards when you put all the bits and pieces together. But unfortunately, at the time, leading up to it, we didn't see it. Everything was calculated, devious. He just thought he was in control and he was going to deal with it the way he had to keep himself squeaky clean.
He'd planned for this and he'd tried to carry it into effect on previous dates. He was determined in his effort to kill his wife and baby Jessica, and that was obvious. On a human aspect, it was very, very much an eye-opener to think that the father could do that to a child, to his wife. It was almost inconceivable.
Police believe Frank McCann set a house fire to kill his wife Esther and foster daughter Jessica. They suspected his motive was to conceal the fact he had a child with a 17-year-old swimming student.
He didn't want his career or his good name destroyed. It was an unusual way of protecting himself and his own good character by murdering his wife and child.
He talked about cleaning up a mess that he'd made, but the cleaning up of the mess that he'd made involved eliminating other people. And just the idea that he was doing this to preserve a facade of respectability that he clearly didn't own in the first place, that was the shocking thing, I think.
Detectives now needed to prove Frank McCann had the opportunity to commit the murder and studied his movements on the night of the fire.
Well, 11 p.m. that night, Frank heads back to the pub. The barman of the pub says that he is there until 1 a.m. when he leaves. The local chip shop owner had meantime said that McCann had been in between 12:30 and 12:40 for a bag of chips and then left. And then another neighbour reported that the gate behind the pub had been heard creaking at 1 a.m. and she presumed that that was Frank.
The starting timescale for Mr. McCann's journey home from Blessington would have been near enough established with the closing of that gate.
Witnesses saw McCann arrive on the scene at 1:30 a.m, half an hour after leaving Blessington. Police needed to prove that was enough time for McCann to make the journey, start the fire, leave the scene, and then return, as if arriving for the first time.
Well, of course, part of my job, apart from surveying the actual scene itself, was to prepare other maps. I was tasked with driving the route along with a member of the investigation team from Blessington to Butterfield Avenue. Drove in the N81 and in towards Tala and on up towards Butterfield. And I calculated the distance of that being 14.5 miles. We drove it twice at normal speed and a little bit maybe over normal. We might have gone over the speed limit once or twice.
Driving from Blessington to Rathfarnham after pub closing time, 1 a.m., no more than 20-25 minutes at the most.
My understanding with the investigation team was that this timing was crucial to support their view that Mr. McCann had time to get to the scene, set the fire, get away from the scene, and appear to arrive beginning a short time after where the fire was in full furnace.
Police could now show McCann had time to start the fire, that he had the means, and that he had a motive.
We had established beyond refute that there was reasonable grounds to arrest him.
In November 1992, 2 months after the deaths of Esther and baby Jessica, Frank McCann was charged with starting the fire, but he had made a further, unexpected confession.
He was arrested under Section 30 of the Offences Against the State Act in relation to criminal damage by arson, and he was detained then for a period of time, 24, and then an extension of another 24 hours. However, the official detention time expired, and Mr. McCann, I understand, returned electively to continue the interview, and during the course of this period he made admissions of murder.
In his statement, Frank McCann described how he hugged baby Jessica, drove to Blessington to close up the pub, then returned to Rathfarnham and started the fire that killed Jessica and his wife, Esther.
Gardaí spoke about how he went into kind of a trance-like state and kind of spoke as if he was there at the time, talked them through everything that had happened.
With his full confession now on record, McCann was charged with arson and double murder. His trial began on the 11th of January 1994, but 2 weeks later came to a dramatic halt.
Today, on the 14th day of the trial, the judge dismissed the jury. McCann wasn't in court when his trial resumed today. He's in hospital recovering from burns after trying to set fire to himself in Arbour Hill Prison last weekend. It's understood that he poured deodorant over his head and then put a match to it.
The question now was whether Frank McCann was legally insane or deliberately attempting to undermine his own trial.
Today, Mr. Justice O'Hanlon told the jury there was a question whether McCann was fit to plead to the murder charges. The case was adjourned until March the 23rd for a jury to decide whether or not he's capable of facing trial.
The court ruled that Frank McCann was fit to face trial for murder, but it was 2 years before he was back in court.
So it was a very protracted, long, agonising time for, I imagine, both the McCann family and for Esther's family as well.
But as the trial at last drew near, preparations were far from straightforward.
Everything with that man was control. Here he was again, trying to control the trial, justice being served.
He had his legal team just running in circles. He had every trick in the book. He knew what he was doing. He knew he could drag this out. And I kind of think he knew he could almost be a celebrity from this trial.
Key to the prosecution case was Frank McCann's confession to murder, but defence lawyers argued the statement should be inadmissible as evidence. They said McCann had been held by police beyond the legal time limit. Detectives claimed otherwise.
It's my understanding that during the statement of admission, the period of time expired and Frank voluntarily came back in to complete the statement of admission.
If the trial judge accepted the defence argument, Frank McCann could walk free from court.
We would have had problems trying to prove the case without the statement of admission.
The judge accepted the confession was given voluntarily and could be admitted as evidence. But McCann still pleaded not guilty, meaning police would have to prove every detail of their case.
The second trial started in June 1996 and it went on for 10 weeks.
The second one was a marathon. I think it ran for 48 days in court, which of actual court time, which is unusually long. I think it was one of the longest cases in history.
Detectives needed to show the fire was caused not just by leaking gas, but that an accelerant was added to intensify the blaze. They commissioned a demonstration by experts in fire scene analysis.
We conducted this experiment in Abington in England with a forensic specialist to recreate the fire in Butterfield Avenue. There was people from the defence and the prosecution there, and we were there for about maybe a week. We were trying to establish that accelerant had been used, and we had videos, and we showed that to the jury during the trial to show that accelerant must be used in this fire to generate the heat.
Young Irish Times journalist Frank McNally spent days in the packed courtroom.
This might well have been the first murder case that I was sent to, and probably the first time that I saw a big case like this involving a huge, long-running investigation and hundreds of witnesses coming to a conclusion, so it was a dramatic thing.
McCann was depicted by his lawyers as a mild-mannered man who would never hurt his family, and onlookers were struck by his calm demeanour.
He was pretty impassive throughout the trial, sat very calmly. On the actual day before the jury went out, I think at one point he was sitting reading a crime novel, and that would have been typical he would be reading if he was not actually talking to his lawyers. But very calm, and because of the glass, slightly austere, long, tall, thin, nerdish looking. There was nothing about him that fitted the notoriety that he earned via this case.
After 48 days in court, the jury retired to consider its verdict.
The jury system, it's a very old thing in a way. It's kind of a medieval thing that if you commit some terrible crime, you are judged by a jury of your peers. It's such a responsibility, people take it very seriously. It's not something they want to get over with in an hour so they can get back to their lives. They do tend to take it very seriously.
It's a tense time, you know, and false dawns and juries are brought back and they want to hear more and what have you, and you're reassembled and out again.
Any verdict had to be unanimous, but the depiction of Frank McCann as an affectionate father had divided the jury. After hours of deliberation, they returned to seek guidance from the judge.
It seems that some members of the jury were troubled by a piece of his original confession where he said that on the night of the fire, beforehand he had picked up baby Jessica and cuddled her and then put her back down to sleep.
Could a man who showed such affection to baby Jessica really have killed her just hours later?
That had sowed some doubt in some members of the jury, clearly, and we think that was why they were struggling with unanimity. That was at 6:15 on Thursday. They went away again. We all settled down thinking it could be several more hours, and instead they came back suddenly 10, 20 minutes later.
The verdict came through that he was guilty.
As the family of the late Mrs. Esther McCann and baby Jessica wept at the back of the courtroom, the judge refused McCann leave to appeal.
It'll take a long time to get over it, but really, it's the end of one chapter. Now we can begin to grieve for Esther and Jessica. They won't be coming back.
My family were so relieved that the trial was finished that most of the adults in my family kind of really broke down that day in tears of exhaustion and just relief.
McCann of Butterfield Avenue, Rathfarnham, was found guilty on 2 charges of murder. Guilty of murdering his wife Esther, and guilty too of murdering 18-month-old baby Jessica. Tonight, Frank McCann is beginning his life sentence in Mountjoy Jail, ending the second longest murder trial in the history of the state.
After 4 years, justice was finally served, but the family's sense of loss is never ending.
I've lost an aunt. I've lost my cousin.
Frank McCann was a control freak. He wanted everything to go his way, to go according to Frank's plan. He was the centre of everything. It was the Frank McCann show, and nothing else. My aunt and Jessica were just little side characters in his story.
It's not something that'll ever go away, unfortunately. It's like it happened last week. There's no turning the page or closing the book. It's as if it's... Every time you see or hear of it, it opens it all up again. It doesn't go away.
McCann received 2 life sentences to run concurrently.
That kind of life sentence generally would last about 20 years. He's obviously been in longer than that, but he'll be out. And you would have to wonder, you know, how fair has it been that he has really only served the length of 1 life sentence?
If anything, it probably makes it harder to live with it, to know that he can still live his life. He's deprived them both of their lives, and he can still carry on as normal.
Certainly that stood out that this man was terribly ruthless, and forgiveness, I cannot see how it could be given.
He's an evil, twisted, calculated person. No remorse, no nothing. Never ever apologised.
After 30 years in prison, in December 2024, Frank McCann was denied parole. Esther and her family remain convinced he should be kept behind bars.
I feel like it is very important for me as Esther's goddaughter and as Esther's niece and as Jessica's cousin that I continue to fight for justice for them. And also, I can't imagine how dangerous the world would be with Frank McCann walking the streets. And I just dread that becoming a reality. There is no one in the world who can convince me that my family will be safe if he gets out.
She was told, you're going to work as a prostitute. She'd never even thought of it before, never encountered it before. She spoke no English. She was told the terminology, what she had to do, how much she charged, and that was just her for the next few years.
They brought me to Belfast. I was made to work as a sex slave. I felt like a battery hand, but for sex.
We're seeing many more foreign nationals being brought in. It raised some suspicion about who was controlling this in Belfast and was there exploitation.
They say if I don't stop crying and do exactly what they say, that they're going to kill my mom.
We would see the victims transported to Stockholm or Belfast, and after a period, then that would move to the next city. This was transnational crime that needed a transnational response.
They took a passport, she was beaten, threatened.
We would track who the money went to and follow that money, so to speak, to find out who was controlling it. We were speaking to the Swedes, we were speaking to the Romanians, we were speaking to Europol. At 1:30 p.m. on that day, we gave the order from Belfast to implement the operation.
Please.
My name is Rachel Skelly. I am currently a detective inspector in the PSNI's Organised Crime Branch, and at the time of this investigation, I was a detective constable in the same branch. I had always wanted to be a detective and was very lucky that when I passed my detective exams, I went into the Organised Crime Branch. We would generally focus on proactive operations. They varied in type. They could be drugs, robberies. At times, we would receive intelligence to say there is a brothel, and as a proactive unit, we would actively take measures to attend such properties in order to safeguard people and to see if there is any criminality. Sometimes it materialises, sometimes it didn't. In June 2012, a young woman approached police and indicated that she had been a victim of trafficking. I met with her and it was just an initial conversation in a coffee shop, very informal. It's all about obviously making her comfortable. The picture she portrayed of what she went through was horrific.
The young woman was in her early 20s and from Romania. She became known as Witness A. Her words are taken from interviews and legal documents and are spoken by an actor.
I was working as a cleaner to make some money. One day, like any other, I was walking from one house to the next cleaning houses, when suddenly I was snatched off the streets. I was kidnapped. I felt someone grabbing me from the back. They dragged me, put me in the car, then locked the door straight away. Then they just drove off. I didn't know where they were taking me. I had no idea. Then they tell me they know who my mom is back home in Romania. They know my mom's name. They know her address. They say if I don't stop crying and do exactly what they say, that they're going to kill my mom. Someone said the words, "This one looks better." At that point, I knew I was to be sold for my body.
It's unimaginable. You know, you might read about it, but whenever you're hearing it from somebody, you realise just the consequences, the impact it has on them.
I was made to work as a sex slave. They advertised me online, then customers would come for sexual services. They would move me from place to place, renting flats to make a pop-up brothel. For example, in Belfast, there was a flat with 2 bedrooms. They never really gave us food or water. The living conditions were just awful.
It's obviously horrible to hear. It shouldn't happen, but it does happen. So we will take every step, do everything in our power to make sure that, you know, that they are safe.
I'm Dougie Grant, Detective Chief Inspector. I've been serving in the PSNI for about 20 years when the case began. Like any police officer, I started in uniform policing. And eventually, I wanted to get into organised crime to use tactics against the most serious criminality that we're seeing. And thankfully, I got selected for C1 Organised Crime Branch and led a team called Gold Team within C1. Human trafficking was a new area for us. At that time that we started the investigation, people still wouldn't admit that it couldn't happen here. It couldn't happen in Northern Ireland. It was becoming so prevalent and so common. We were seeing many more foreign nationals being brought in to work in that industry, and it raised some suspicion about who was controlling this in Belfast and was there exploitation.
Detectives began examining the websites where the women were advertised. In 2012, these sites were still a new phenomenon.
We were seeing in our general life a huge digitalisation of everything we do, online shopping, online services, websites, And criminality is no different.
Adult services websites are obviously where sexual services are offered by escorts. It was new to me. I hadn't really heard of it before. At that time, the advertisements were generally in newspapers, whereas then we seen it evolve the online world, and that's when it just seemed to expand and boom.
As the team investigated further, they discovered evidence of brothels springing up right across Northern Ireland and suspected other women were being trafficked.
As a result of the information that Witness A provided us, we had attended a brothel and spoke to a number of young women.
But Rachel and Doogie immediately faced a problem.
We didn't get the support of the victims. They wouldn't engage. And we thought that would be an easy thing to do, but it wasn't. We would go into the premise under a search warrant. We would identify the potential victims, and we'd say, we're here to help you, and we'd offer them places of safety. And we had a victim support network that would support and look after any victims identified. We would offer all the support and services to remove them from that exploitation, but they just wouldn't take it.
The victims were simply unable to break from the physical and psychological control of the sex trafficking ring.
Over time, they were just so groomed. They are told, you fear the police. They were schooled what to say. If you ever encounter police, you say you're on holiday, you know, the police are corrupt. They didn't trust us.
Witness A had been held captive by the gang for 10 months. Breaking the cycle of coercive control had not been easy for her.
I was thinking to escape. That was my thought. But they knew where my mom was. They knew everything about me. I thought I couldn't talk to the police, so I had nothing to cling on to. You want to run. That's one side of it. You want that. But at the same time, you can't run. I had nowhere to go. I didn't think things could get much worse. And then one day, I heard my captors talking about plans to take me to the Middle East. So I knew my opportunity to escape was now or never. So I opened the door and I just ran. I had freedom, and that's why I went to the police.
Witness A's experiences, the number of websites offering sexual services, were evidence of a criminal enterprise entirely new to Doogie and his team.
At that time, prostitution in Northern Ireland, it was local. It wasn't an organised crime issue. It wasn't in that severe category of criminality that we'd see. So this had changed. As we gathered more intelligence and evidence, we identified a Romanian-based crime gang. They would traffic normally Romanian women into Belfast. We would see first an advance party coming in, as we called it, and that would be one or two individuals who would start renting properties, who would start putting the advertising on the various websites, who would start taking the calls and bookings. And then following that advance party, then we'd have the victims who would be travelling in. And the victims would be taken to the locations that had been set up. And then within sometimes minutes, the sex buyers would be arriving to avail of the services. They would operate for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then the women would be moved to a new city or location, and we'd see it happening. The cycle would continue then again.
Detectives Doogie and Rachel now began to look at the individuals running the trafficking ring.
Witness A gave us the details of the organised crime group members. A male principal, Elia Annett, and his partner. And Kuda Swartz would have been what we would refer to as an alpha female. They're the controller. They are generally in the presence of the other females who they make to operate as escorts, and it's obviously to have that control over them.
Identifying the ringleaders was one thing, but proving their involvement in court wouldn't be as easy. So police turned to the digital evidence left by the gang's online activities. It showed their trafficking and prostitution ring was international in scale.
As part of our new developing area of cyber investigations, we started scraping data from different websites and looking for commonality in advertising and imagery. And it started highlighting that there was commonality. We were seeing the same images go to other European countries. But predominantly it was between Sweden, Stockholm, and Northern Ireland, Belfast. And that's what we were seeing, the movement of the images. 2 weeks in one location, 3 weeks in one location, then moving to the next location.
Because of cyber capabilities, we were able to see that the profiles or the pictures used here in Northern Ireland were also used in the south of Ireland and Sweden. Hence why we've seen the connection. We could then see the movement of the victims and the suspects into Sweden.
The data from the website was critically important because it showed the locations where they're operating from. They were using IP addresses and identifying where they were accessing the internet.
The team's digital investigation showed the gang was active in Northern Ireland and Sweden, but it was run from Romania, home to Ilya Anit and Ankuta Schwartz.
We identified the Romanian gang were based initially in Bucharest, and then we would see the victims transported to Stockholm or Belfast, the images uploaded onto the websites, and after a period then that would move to the next city. This was transnational crime that needed a transnational response.
My name is Per Hjort. I'm a detective sergeant at the Swedish police. When the case came in Stockholm, I was working with a division that's worked against human trafficking for sexual purposes. We got a phone call from the PSNI and said that they had seen websites and the Romanian ring working in Belfast. And they said that we had the same girls on different websites. We kept in contact, sharing some information. They all started when our prostitution squad noticed a girl in a part of Stockholm. They went there and they noticed that she was working and there was customers.
Detectives continued their surveillance of the young woman, whose face they recognised from images on sex websites used by the gang in Northern Ireland. She became known to the investigation as Witness B.
We had 2 surveillance teams and we were filming the gang, where they lived, meeting customers, following them around. It was our division, it was the whole section. So we had Witness B on lots of pictures. We had some surveillance, see what she was doing. She was working, she was going on out calls to hotels and taking customers in their apartment. So we needed a statement from Witness B. She was the key witness to get the things to court.
Witness B eventually agreed to give a statement. She revealed how she had been deceived by the traffickers and transported across Europe, only to be forced into prostitution. First in Belfast, and then in Stockholm.
During that period when we get more and more information, it was clear that she was a victim.
Witness B's words are taken from her own statements and are voiced by an actor.
I was 18 years old, living in Romania. A neighbor knew Ankuta Schwartz, and that I could get some work if I came to Northern Ireland. She said it would only be webcam posing, sitting in front of a computer in sexy clothes. Schwartz paid for my flight in March 2011. When I arrived, Ionuț picked me up from the airport, and Schwartz was waiting at the apartment we went to. She explained to me that it wouldn't be online work. Instead, I would have to perform sexual services. I was in shock, but saw no other option but to do as I was told. On my very first day, within hours of landing at the airport, I had to take a customer.
A year later, she was still in the control of the gang and being trafficked between Belfast and Stockholm.
Then we contacted the PSNI again. Doug and Rachel said that there are more Romanian girls probably heading for Sweden.
The victims were being transported through so many jurisdictions that the PSNI and the Swedish Police Authority decided to seek international cooperation across Europe.
On normal investigations with an international footprint, we'd usually reach out directly to the law enforcement in that particular country. But on this occasion, we decided to approach Europol. Europol is a European police agency based in The Hague.
It was my first joint investigation team. It was a new thing to work with colleagues abroad. I had big cases before. This was a new ballpark.
Detectives brought in the global expert in human trafficking investigations to assist the team.
My name's Kevin Hyland, and I'm a former UK police officer. I was the head of the human trafficking unit for New Scotland Yard.
Kevin Hyland has investigated how human trafficking gangs operate internationally and provided insights to the United Nations.
At this time, I had done a number of what we call joint investigation teams with a number of countries. The team from Northern Ireland came to meet with me, and everyone agreed that this was a case that would benefit from having investigation capability in Northern Ireland with Sweden and with Romania as a partner.
It enabled us to share information at a fast pace and obviously move the investigation on probably much quicker than it would have been done previously.
The notion of, this kind of coercive control in the issue of human trafficking, it was always used. I remember I used to talk about the invisible handcuffs. Most of these people who came over had never been to the UK before, had never been outside of their region. And they just become like robots with no decision-making. And so they were just completely disorientated. So when they were told go from A to B, that's what they did.
Kevin recommended the Northern Irish and Swedish task force begin a coordinated surveillance strategy. In Belfast, this meant sending undercover officers into the brothels.
The objectives of those covert deployments, it was to engage with the adverts, find the premises, and then gather evidence inside those premises about the controllers, the security, the victims themselves. When we're in premises, be it a hotel room, be it an apartment, there's lots of different things we're looking for. Ultimately, this is about gathering evidence so we could save the victims. But the level of organisation and control and security and safety checks that the crime gang would put in place, it was extreme. Being searched for recording devices, being checked for covert cameras, being screened before you come into the premises, that you're sent to a standoff location so they can look to see if there's surveillance around you. It was a challenging situation. Our officers were unaccustomed to this, so we had to train them, we had to educate them, we had to gather information about how this business operated and how sex buyers operated, and that was a challenge. Some existing sex workers would work with us to tell us how this worked normally, what to look for and what the signs were, and that actually really helped us in the investigation.
In particular, undercover officers were able to gather information about the gang's financial activities.
One of the main inquiries for us around the suspects was financial work. We could see that there was a lot of money transactions being made at money services bureaus. The young women who were being exploited were either going and lodging the money. It wasn't actually the suspects doing it themselves. The girls were having to do it.
We would track who the money went to and follow that money, so to speak, to find out who was controlling it. And then when we gathered the evidence, we had the documentation showing that it was paid to the head of the crime gang back in Romania.
And that was Ili Anit and his partner Ankuta Schwartz, the same two people Witness A had named as being her traffickers. Detectives were now in no doubt about the focus of their investigation.
The two ringleaders for the gang were a couple, Ili Anit and Ankuta Schwartz. Ili Anit is the head of the gang. They were Romanian nationals, and they had been involved in controlling prostitution, and we suspected human trafficking for many years.
The gang leaders themselves were now placed under surveillance in Sweden and in their native Romania. It revealed how Anit was spending the money he had earned from trafficking women.
Iliana would stay in the majority of his time in Romania. But we are aware from the evidence that was being gathered by the Swedish law enforcement and others that he was making a lot of money. He would party, he had new cars, he was living a very expensive lifestyle. And all this was coming from the exploitation of the women.
Ilya was just collecting money back in Romania. He was the top dog in the ring. So he was all involved big time, I will say.
And Chris Swartz and Anna were using the money that was being made because they wanted this luxury life back in Romania, whereas people were being exploited to get that. I think it was great.
If you take a girl like Witness B, we could see that she'd been in Sweden over 100 days during the period. And she said that she had approximately 4 to 5 customers a day.
The amount of money that was being made could be as much as £100,000 a year per woman. So, you know, you think if you've got 10, you're a millionaire. And your outlay, you know, rental properties weren't as expensive then as they are now. They would bring people over on the cheapest routes, so everything would be done at the cheapest cost. And then your return was enormous.
In Stockholm, the surveillance operation revealed key details about how the sex trafficking ring operated.
That was Akunta was in control here. And also Ilya showed up sometimes in Sweden as well, and we were gathering economic transactions and started to see how much money they spent on flats and everything, collecting all the evidence. They rented flats. Sometimes they had 2, 3 flats. They also made out calls, customer calls for a girl, and then they had their own drivers. If they didn't have any drivers on scene, they would send them by taxi. They rented in different parts of the downtown Stockholm. It builds the case. You can see what do they do, how many customers do they have, and which apartments do they operate today, or where are they going now. And if you follow the girls from one flat, they can also give service in another flat. You can see the customer on the outside waiting to get the code to come in, and then you can follow him across the yard, and he goes into one of the staircases. It shows how they operate. It's not that far from here. We can walk to one of the flats, 600 meters or something from the City Hall.
We are now at a place where they rented apartments to give services for sexual purposes. And on the other side of the street, 15 meters on the other side, there's the Stockholm Police Department, and we have the police headquarters on the other side of the street, so they were quite near. During the surveillance, we saw a guy coming on a bicycle with a small toddler. He stopped by kindergarten, delivered the children, and on his way back home in the same area, he then stopped and made a visit in one of those apartments.
The customers would call the number on the profile on the website. Ankuta would usually answer and arrange the visits. The services listed on my profile were extreme. 69, anal sex, bondages, fetishes. I had to do everything Ankuta said.
It seems like some people think it's not a big deal. It's a transaction. Everything was fine, but if you look behind the mask, it's a victim. She's not there by free will. That's an illusion. Once you're trapped, you're trapped.
As one man after another visited the apartment, Witness B followed the gang's orders and transferred large sums of money back to Romania.
One responsibility they gave me was depositing the money at the money exchange places. The cash was always wired to Swartz or Ionuț or their families back in Romania. They made me take pictures of the paperwork to prove I'd sent all of it.
The gang controlled the women by telling them they would be given money to send back to their families.
If that's the only way you can support your family back home, and you have gone that far, so you sell your body to send money back to Romania. They told the parents probably back home that they were doing au pair service or work as a cleaner or whatever. And the family were dependent on them to survive.
But the women saw none of the money.
They told me I'd keep half the money earned. I was in debt from the beginning. I was told the flight needed to be paid off, and after that there were always more costs. For example, website costs, always costs. So I never got paid anything, and all the money went to Ancuța. This is the way it worked for all the girls. The girls and me would be moved from place to place throughout Northern Ireland, places in Belfast, then in Sweden, Stockholm, places near there, then back to Northern Ireland. You lose track of where you are. After a while, it's all the same. Sweden, Northern Ireland, it's all the same.
Witness B was by now living under the total control of Ancuța Schwartz.
Over time, Ancuța got me to do more of her work. Organizing the flats, she'd send me out for groceries and to do the laundry, that kind of thing. I had to do everything Ancuța said. At first glance, someone might think we were friends, but it was more like I was her prisoner.
My name's Diane, and I work for Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid. I think one of the things is we see that women look like they're walking about on their daily lives. They're able maybe to go to the shop. Why do they not just leave and find help? And I think that's where we look at the definition and we look at what coercive control actually is.
Diane works to support survivors of human trafficking and sexual abuse.
The fear that women experience, what's out there, where are they going to go when they leave, the mistrust, who does she turn to, who does she go to? That psychological imprisonment is what actually women are experiencing, that they feel they cannot escape, they cannot go anywhere through a matter of fear and desperation.
Surveillance in Stockholm provided Doug and Rachel with valuable intelligence. But the investigation was about to be transformed, with evidence gathered by Swedish police using a power unavailable to detectives in Northern Ireland: phone tapping.
The European law enforcement agencies used what we call telephone intercept very extensively for gathering evidence. It's not something in the UK that we'd ever be allowed to do in that kind of situation. But getting access to that level of intelligence was critical for us. We were able to gather more information on the sex buyers, how they were interacting.
The wiretaps captured a side of the victims' lives that the surveillance footage could not.
It was very difficult to listen to some of the telephone calls. Just give it a minute.
Să faci bani aici pizda să te țin. Plus chinii trebuie să-i scol la pensie, cât de curând. Dă-i dracu de bani de-astea, dacă vrei să facem treaba așa cum spun eu. Da, domne, e acceptat, da, domne, cu tare, ok, dă-te dracu. Da, tot o să mă caute, că n-are ce să facă, înțelegi?
On the wiretap, we heard Akunta talking about Witness B. Witness B was treated very bad. They took a passport, she was beaten, threatened. In the mornings, Akunta will check the mobile phones, have any customer made any calls during the night. We had her on the wiretaps. I couldn't yelling at her, why don't you answer the phone? Come back in 50 minutes, otherwise I kill you. Finish that customer. You have another customer waiting here.
Clients could also be heard on the wiretap complaining if a victim was unwilling to perform certain sexual acts.
Hello.
Hello.
What is your problem?
She do what is in the profile. It's only like that. You understand? You don't talk to some bullshit idiot. Listen, we start with this.
If you want, I can send now, okay? No problem.
Okay. Okay, then I call police. Papa.
And Kutza Schwartz would shout at me and beat me. It really hurt. I was only allowed to sleep 3 or 4 hours per night. She would spit on me to wake me up. Things got worse. Worse than the services listed on the website. I was made to receive customers even when I was having my period. Sometimes I had clients who demanded that condoms not be used. Schwartz made me go with all of this. She told me a wet wipe could be inserted in my vagina for protection. I really believed her. So I did this. I never wanted to do this.
Financial records, surveillance footage and phone recordings all implicated Elliot Annett and Ankuta Schwartz. But to prove they were controlling prostitution in Belfast, Dougie needed to prove that the pair were in the city. So he went back to basics.
This investigation was being conducted in a number of ways, and through the digital evidence, we identified IP addresses that were being used, and that brought us to this area that we believed had been used by the group. And some of our investigators were fantastic, and they just decided, let's just do what we call old school policing, just to go and knock on doors and ask people, did you see anything? Have you seen anything suspicious in the area over the last few weeks or months?
Now, these old school methods brought new information.
To everyone's surprise and shock, they knocked a door. A gentleman answered, and they explained what they were there for. And he said, I know exactly what you're looking for. And he produced photographs that he had taken of what he called suspicious activity. And that suspicious activity was foreign nationals that had come in with young women, and they appeared to be in control of them. And it didn't sit right with them. We couldn't believe it. It was the ringleaders from the gang. It was the two suspects that we'd always identified in other countries, but we never managed to get them all together in Belfast, and we now had a picture of them. The photograph that we obtained, it put the two main suspects on the ground at the time in the area of the establishments that were being used for this. It was critical for us. It just moved the investigation on weeks, if not months. All the different layers of evidence, from the travel, from the website bookings, from the IP evidence, the verification photographs, it was all building the picture. At some point, we had to say, let's go now. And I was in discussions with my counterpart in Sweden. And as we were having that meeting one day, we got a notification that the victims were moving again. The adverts were being brought down. They were going to set up somewhere else. Would they go back to Stockholm? Would they come back to Belfast? We didn't know. So we made an immediate decision at that point. It's now. Now, let's do this now.
Detectives in all three countries now planned an audacious operation. A coordinated strike on the gang in Northern Ireland, Romania and Sweden.
We needed to arrest Ilyanat as well, and he was in Romania, so it was to get everything in one, all the small pieces in one bucket.
At this point, we said, we have victims in Belfast, we have victims in Stockholm, so let's take action now. And that was decided to be the 25th of April, 2013. We said we're going to have the day of action right across Europe simultaneously.
In Stockholm, police needed to rescue victims from the control of their traffickers. In Bucharest, police planned to arrest Elliot Annett, and in Belfast, Doogie's target was Ankuta Schwartz, who was in control of Witness B. And this all had to happen at exactly the same moment.
As I was sitting in the control van in the street, we were speaking to the Swedes, we were speaking to the Romanians, we were speaking to Europol. At 1:30 p.m. on that day, we gave the order from Belfast to implement the operation. We didn't want to send dozens of people into our premises to just overwhelm the situation and the victims. Whilst we had dozens of officers deployed, we tried to reduce the numbers that actually went into the premises. Maybe 6 officers going in initially, but ready to respond if the situation escalated inside.
So, please. Please, do you speak English? Police officers?
I'm arresting you under Section 3, Swedish Penal Code. What do you do?
This warrant has been obtained for offences committed in Sweden.
But I'm here, no, in Sweden.
Yes. These offences occurred in Sweden.
For
which
what?
were
What can
executed
I do in Sweden?
Aggravated procuring.
What is this?
Prostitution.
Prostitution.
Prostitution, right.
We identified 2 victims in Belfast. We made the arrests, and simultaneously we were doing arrests in Bucharest, gathering all the digital evidence, the telephones and the laptops, the computers. In Sweden, more victims being rescued.
It's challenging. I think you really want to help. They were all told that they knew their families back home and they would harm their families, and they genuinely believed that, and there was that real risk. They definitely weren't living, and I think as time went on, it was very apparent that the control became more and more, and that's whenever the force became more. What they were put through was just absolutely horrific. They'd no quality of life, being in a country on your own at times, having nowhere to turn because she did have that distrust. She didn't know anybody, she didn't know where to go.
Detectives moved quickly to gather evidence, but also to see to the victims' welfare.
When we deal with victims of human trafficking in Northern Ireland, our priority for them is to get them support and access to services. Support from Women's Aid, it gives them access to doctors and health, so that was something that we ensured from the outset that they got.
There was ourselves, the police and Red Cross, and also interpreters, which were added into the mix as well because the women were foreign nationals, didn't speak English. So we sat with each woman and explained what our service was and what we could provide, and had an open conversation with them.
The women were very fearful because they didn't understand what was happening.
Lovely really to meet you. My name is Heather and I work for Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid and I support female victims.
Some of the young women, their clothing looked as if they hadn't been changed in a long time. They looked as if they hadn't had facilities for showers for a long time. We did one-to-ones with them and made them understand that, you know, this wasn't their fault, this was a crime against them, and that the police were investigating. At that stage, the women didn't want to engage, but we did give them our telephone numbers and our names, and later that week, some of the women got in contact with us, and we were able to carry on building a relationship with the women and give them that one-to-one support.
After Ankuta was arrested, it was strange for her to be gone. She had such power over me, now it was gone.
It was an intense 48 hours following that day of action as we brought suspects to custody, executing European arrest warrants, bringing the victims into places of safety, debriefing them and telling them what we knew and getting their support. It was an intense time. I don't think the investigation team slept for 2 days.
They treated me brutally. Only animals can do that to people. If I'm saying no, they have no heart. They sell people who are living.
There's a process the brain would go through that they take themselves off into another place, so you can disconnect as well.
She said, one day I'll put a knife in you.
With human trafficking, we work extensively over a long period of time with women, but this one, I think it was a month or so before they returned home.
Now began to prepare for trial. Their case relied heavily on evidence from witness A and B, but both women were still vulnerable to threats of violence from the gang.
After the police arrested the ringleaders and rescued the other girls, I had to step back. They had always threatened my family right from the start, so I couldn't risk going to court. I couldn't do a statement. I had too much fear for my family and for my safety.
Witness A withdrew from the trial. It was a serious blow to the case.
We needed the victim testimony. We needed that victim evidence to say how this actually occurred and the level of control and fear that they had, because that was the really impactful aspect of this case, to show that level of control, coercion, and exploitation.
Now the entire case rested on witness B agreeing to take part in the trial.
She was scared what could happen if I start to give evidence. What will happen to my family? What will happen to my life? She was in a very vulnerable situation. When she decided to go along and give a statement, I think she felt it was the right thing to do.
I managed to pull myself together, but inside I still feel like a small, anxious girl.
Witness B's corporation ensured a trial could go ahead.
We made a decision in the large stage of the investigation that it was more effective to have the prosecution in Stockholm. We were able to use different forms of evidence. We were able to use the telephone intercept evidence. It resulted in the suspects being extradited to Stockholm.
They were immediately extradited to Sweden. The trial took place there. Myself and a colleague interviewed Ankudda Swartz in the prison. She said she wasn't a controller. She didn't take any money, denied any responsibility, any knowledge. She then said that Ilya Annett, who was her partner, who she had a child with, he was actually controlling her, and that she tried to then say that she was a victim. She changed her story.
It would now be up to the court to decide the truth. Witness B's evidence could not have been more important.
My name is Eva Windsau, and I work at the National Public Prosecution Department. We work with organized crime in Stockholm.
Witness B's testimony was vital to Eva's case, but she was concerned the pressure might be too much for her.
How will this victim be able to talk in front of them? It could have ruined everything. She hadn't been able to speak out and tell her story in the courtroom. I didn't know if she were going to manage that.
Ilya became very angry when he found out that witness B should give statements, so he threatened. He said during the interrogation, "I will kill her," tried to threat a witness.
Eva petitioned the court to spare witness B from testifying in front of the people who had trafficked and controlled her.
I was a bit nervous, so I think we had done everything we could do. I remember that first day when the court had the pause and was thinking about, will we accept this request or not? They said no. Then I was, oh God, are we going to manage this or not?
Witness B now took to the stand and faced her traffickers.
I was worried that she wouldn't manage to give her story in front of the suspect. I think she found it very hard to sit in front of the suspect to tell her story, but she did. She did it very well.
The trial lasted nearly 2 months. At the end, Annett and Schwartz were found guilty of human trafficking and controlling prostitution.
I think the work that we'd done, that we were satisfied that there was no way they were going to avoid a conviction. Ultimately, it was successful, and we were able to then identify more victims who were previously or currently being exploited.
When we spoke to Witness B as a victim in Sweden, the one thing I would say was the difference in her demeanour. It was unbelievable. She was confident. She obviously could speak a bit of English at that stage. She was happy. She was hugging us. The Swedish police had obviously done so much to gain her trust and turn her life around.
We were very pleased, and as said, because it's quite rare that we manage to prosecute and get a conviction for human trafficking. So that was very good for our team and for the police team as well.
Annett and Schwartz were both sentenced to 4 years in prison to be served in Sweden.
The sentences, though, were light. People would say, is that enough for what they committed? The sentencing is a matter for the courts, and we won't make judgment on that. But it was a prosecution.
The suspects were jailed in Sweden, and detectives had a strategy for making sure they also faced justice for their crimes in Northern Ireland.
The agreement was that when they were released, we would then extradite them to Belfast, and they would come into Belfast courts and we would prosecute them for the criminality here. So I think when they were released from prison in Stockholm, they expected to return home, and I think the disappointment they had, that they thought they were going to walk away from this, was evident at the time. We brought them back to Belfast and they were remanded back into custody.
However, laws in Northern Ireland and Sweden are different, so the team could not rely on using all of the same evidence again.
In Sweden, they are allowed to use telephone intercept. In the UK, and including Northern Ireland, telephone intercept is not allowed to be used in evidence.
But prosecution lawyers had already prepared a way to make sure the contents of the recordings could be shared with the court. Per himself would describe what he heard.
When they were planning the trial in Belfast, I was asked to come over and give a statement about what we had found out on the wiretaps, because in Northern Ireland you can't use the wiretap, but I could have told them what we hear on the tapes.
Faced with Per's testimony, Annett and Schwartz each pleaded guilty to human trafficking, controlling prostitution and money laundering. They were sentenced to a further 2 years in prison.
I think what was done on this joint investigation team, with prosecutions in one country and then, doing prosecutions in another jurisdiction, I really think it's a great model. And if somebody decides they're going to commit crimes in 2 jurisdictions, you should expect to face the penalties of 2 jurisdictions.
I would hope in the future that we would see longer sentences that would reflect the type of abuse and criminality that they've inflicted on the victims. But I think we did see a change as a result of this investigation. We certainly saw the disruption of the crime group. We certainly saw the victims being rescued and removed from this exploitation.
The perpetrators may have been brought to justice in 2 jurisdictions, but the market for women trafficked for sex remained.
If you sell drugs, you sell them as a one-off. You sell a woman, and you can sell her over and over and over.
1st of January 2024 to the 31st of December 2024, we supported 473 women just in human trafficking. We had 129 children and we had 47
Buying girls for sexual purposes is just feeding the organized crime.
I think if we're going to predominantly men who are buying sexual services,
Look out, and if they do see something different that's happening out there on the streets, to make the police aware of it, because that's the only way we're ever going to win.
This case was actually in some ways quite groundbreaking, but human trafficking isn't going away, and it's something that we continuously, actively pursue and are so dedicated to doing it. It means a lot to me personally. I'm now the DI in that team. We're working with victims, so we will take every step, do everything in our power to make sure that we eradicate it as best we can.
As a result of the investigation, 13 women were rescued from sex trafficking. Witnesses A and B each now live free in Europe under new identities.
I know that whilst it was horrific, both those witnesses are okay, and it's really nice to see.
You have to be glad for when you succeed. Yeah, I'm proud for our division, also for the PSNI. It was a good case.
we're able to bring all the tactics, all the capability, and all the expertise within the PSNI and European law enforcement working with us to stop this crime. And that's why I'll never forget this crime.
Now I'm wiser. And going through that experience, it gave me more strength because I can appreciate my value as a person, as a human being, and even as a woman. I have reasons to live today, and that will not be taken away.